Roundup. Like many of us in this country, I am in a childhood bedroom. My name is David Dayen. I'm executive editor of The Prospect. And with me today is our writing fellow, Emma Janssen. Emma, how are you?
I am doing very well. Yesterday was the first day of snow in Chicago, so it was amazing. And now it's all melted, but
But you're in Chicago now, but are you going back to the Bay Area for Thanksgiving?
yes, I am on the 25th, so I think Monday. I'm getting a flight and I will be home for a little over a week.
Right, and you will be working from childhood bedrooms as well. So, very good. We are in, I guess it's week two of the Trump 2.0 rollout. We've already seen one Scaramucci, one person last less than a week's time, and that's Matt Gaetz, who was the nominee for Attorney General until the weight of scandal simply crushed him, and he moved on out. And Trump wasted no time in selecting someone who I have a passing familiarity with, and that is Pam Bondi, who was the Attorney General of Florida. And if you go to prospect.org today, you can read about the fact that her uh, term in office was marked at the beginning by the removal of two prosecutors who were the first prosecutors to actually investigate what I call foreclosure fraud, which was the mass use of phony documents to kick people out of their homes. June Clarkson and Teresa Edwards were those two prosecutors. They were instrumental in getting, in October 2010, essentially a moratorium on all foreclosures in the country because nobody could do them legally anymore. They had confused confused the ownership so much on foreclosures and then used false evidence in the form of phony documents, brought them into courts. That became untenable. And June and Teresa were really at the height of that, and that was at right before the election of 2010, which brought Pam Bondi into the Florida Attorney General's office, thanks to contributions from individuals and companies that were implicated in this foreclosure fraud. And so when she got in, she first neutered June Clarkson, Teresa Edwards, took away their cases, said they weren't allowed to speak to any other AG offices who were investigating foreclosure fraud, didn't even allow them to send transition notes to the other attorneys who were given their cases, and then summarily fired them and then smeared them on the way out the door, saying that they were, unprofessional. So this is how Pam Bondi operates on behalf of her donors, and stopping efforts directly intended to help the people and prevent people from getting ripped off. So that's she is a distillation of this kind of tendency, and she'll fit in perfectly for a Donald Trump who wants to take out enemies, perceived enemies at the Justice Department. She's expert in that, and after she finished her term, you know, getting rid of good attorneys at the Florida Attorney General's office, she became a lobbyist for companies like Amazon and Uber and General Motors and even the government of Qatar. So we got a real
Oh, wow.
winner here in Pam Bondi. Matt Gaetz was certainly a sleazeball and deserving of everything that he got, but at the same time, it's careful of what you wish for, getting the kinder and gentler,
Yeah.
corporate goon,
Yeah.
in this case, the DOJ. Any thoughts on that, Emma?
No, I mean, I agree, especially with the last part. Matt Gaetz just seemed like such a shocking nomination just because of how unqualified he is for the job. that's forgetting all of his personal issues and crimes allegedly and um, sleaziness. But yeah, it seems like the new nominee is someone who can, she has a proven track record of doing harm, and that is very scary. So yeah, I agree. Everything you
Mhm.
said sounds true.
Well, you wrote this week about another one of our celebrated nominees here, and that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And you drew
Yes.
upon, I think, some of your own personal kind of
Yeah.
background and history and in crunchy Northern California. So talk about what you see in RFK
Yeah.
and the sort of ways in which maybe some Democrats at least see some of the things that he's promoted over the years and say, well, that doesn't sound that bad.
Yeah. So I have was thinking a lot about RFK Jr. and really, it became clear that he does have some level of kind of broad appeal. He's not someone who is just loved by Republicans or people on the far right or anything like that. You have people very much decently far on the left who think that some of his ideas are good and that really resonate with them. And so some of those ideas would be like, you know, RFK Jr. has been really huge on talking about getting the influence of big ag and big pharma out of government. And it he is a very conspiratorial minded person. So whenever there's sort of this, you know, control over the government, groups that have control over the government, you have to be skeptical. But at least for those, they do have a lot of control and a lot of money vested in what the government does. So a lot of people on the left, including me, including, um, Colorado Governor Jared Polis, arguably Senator Cory Booker, are also interested in making sure that there is less corporate influence over the price of drugs, what drugs are approved, what food companies are protected and elevated versus not. Um, so there is this broad appeal. And then, of course, like David was saying, if you grew up somewhere like the Bay Area, where I grew up, or, I'm sure parts of Colorado and other parts of the Pacific Northwest, people who always eat organic, they're always outside talking about the health benefits of sunlight and moving your body and eating organic food. I know I said that, and vitamins, and that is kind
Herbal
of a
remedies, health
herbal
supplements.
remedies.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like turn to this, turn to some sunlight and some water and some tea before you go get a prescription medication for whatever.
Go get some
Um,
echinacea, go get some, yeah.
exactly. And that is something, have your local honey. That's something that RFK Jr. talks about all the time. And so that is, it can be
Yeah. I mean,
appealing.
I feel like that's true.
Mhm.
I feel like it's not so much based on price, it's based on health, right? He's saying
Mm.
that, hey, the
Yes.
Food and Drug Administration goes too far in blocking certain drugs like maybe
Mhm.
ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, and
Chloroquine.
they're doing a disservice to the public. Or these factory farms are putting all kinds of hormones in meat, or there's ultra processed foods, much
Mhm.
like the McDonald's that he famously ate on a plane in a photo
Mhm.
with Trump and his some of his hangers on. Um, it's all about like health and wellness and those kinds of things. It's not so much about they're ripping us off necessarily.
Yeah,
I don't hear that as much from RFK Jr. And to be clear,
I
like
agree.
I've been on radio shows with RFK Jr. He used to do a show on Air America, and they
Yeah.
would have me on a couple times. So
Oh,
I've
wow.
I've talked to him, and
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, and
That's
yeah,
something I
go ahead.
was trying to figure out is does he have kind of like a coherent political or economic ideology, or is it just based on what he personally thinks is healthy? And I do think it is more the latter. Like was trying to figure out, is he a very super like libertarian minded, like everyone should just be able to try and do whatever they want to do? Not necessarily, because
Right.
for some things, for some substances, he wants more regulation, and for others, he wants no regulation. So I do agree. I don't think there's necessarily a super coherent ideology beyond just, I think this is healthy. This is what should be
Right.
elevated.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, some of the real questions that are facing the next Secretary of Health and Human Services are really in the price realm. So,
Yeah.
the Inflation Reduction Act put together this Medicare price negotiation regime, which says that Medicare is allowed to negotiate over the price of certain prescription drugs. New drugs are supposed to come online for negotiation every year, and it's going to be
Yep.
up to the Secretary of HHS to figure out what those prices are going to be, and then to implement them. All of that is going to be under the purview of RFK Jr. And what does he think about that?
Yeah.
What does he want to do there? That to me seems to be more immediately in the control of someone
Hmm.
like him, rather than we should generally make factory farms more expensive, right?
Yeah.
Making factory farms more expensive, or did I say more expensive? I mean, more healthy, or eliminating them. Um, that's really in the purview of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And, within the first Trump administration, USDA was not helpful to family farms whatsoever. In fact, Sonny Perdue, who was the former governor of Georgia, and he was the first Trump USDA secretary, he famously said that in America, the big get bigger and everybody else gets out. He was in favor of consolidating power
Yeah.
in agriculture. This was at a time when there were like mass rashes of suicides among
Mm-hmm.
dairy farmers in
Mm-hmm.
Wisconsin. I remember reporting that dairy farms, the producers were giving information about suicides in with their paychecks to farmers. That's how
Wow.
widespread this was at that time. And so, RFK Jr. coming out and saying factory farms are terrible, that's great, but is he going to
Yeah.
actually have the ability to do anything about that?
Yeah. And then briefly, one last note on something you brought up, and then there's some stuff in the chat praising you, David. Um,
That's fine.
yeah, when you look at the list of drugs under Medicaid that were already approved and prices were lowered, which will come into effect in 2026, they
Yeah,
are things to treat, diabetes, um, heart disease, uh, you know,
right,
blood clotting disorders, some of the chronic illnesses that, anyone who works in healthcare can tell you are the biggest issues facing Americans in terms of chronic
right.
illness. And that is something that RFK talks about constantly. It's like America is chronically ill. So if he actually wants to kind of make good on that, I don't know that, like you said, going after whatever is going to help, but making those medications available will.
Right. I mean, you put it in a good way in the piece. You said, "Well, look, we all want to slow down chronic disease. We all want to have less chronic disease in America. But what about the people who already have it? We need to manage their
Exactly.
treatments, and we need to make it accessible for them to mitigate the worst effects of those chronic diseases. And
Exactly.
Medicare price negotiation is one way to do that. On the flip side, there are things that may be in the control of the Health and Human Services Secretary, but they aren't necessarily good things for the American people, where they
Yep.
intersect with RFK's kind of quack beliefs, and vaccines would be the number one thing around that, right?
Yep. Exactly. Vaccines, and you mentioned them earlier, but an example I wrote about in my article is, the FDA, and so by extension HHS, played a role in regulating and putting out public health information on ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, which were both
Right.
used as kind of off-label, incorrect use to treat COVID-19 and cause real harm. And so, if God forbid something like the pandemic, or even just something on a much smaller scale, were to happen again in some subsect of the population, and we didn't have an HHS that was willing to kind of take these drugs out of contention for emergency use, and to put out public health information warning against them, I don't know what could happen. It could be disastrous for, whatever population is ill.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So, and then, what we did learn this week is, more about who that health team is going to be.
Hmm.
And so we don't have just RFK, but we have Dr. Oz to contend with, who will be apparently named the head of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And this is bad on a couple fronts. I mean, number one, he is the kind of guy that hawked a lot of supplements and herbal remedies and things like that, but
Yeah.
usually ones with that were found later to have no actual benefits to people.
Yeah.
But maybe even worse than that, because of the position he's going into, uh, he has been a paid spokesman for health insurance companies that are private Medicare companies that
Mhm.
are part of this system called Medicare Advantage, which is the privatization of Medicare. About half of all new enrollees now go into Medicare Advantage. And it's incredibly costly to the system. And there are two big problems. One is overbilling, and the other is under delivery.
Mhm.
Overbilling in the sense of using various health codes to basically bilk the federal government. And there have been, published studies from the Medicare Payment Advisory Council, or MedPAC, that have said that this costs the government about $100 billion a year. So that's a trillion over 10 years. That's half of what Doge wants to find, right? That's $1 trillion over a decade. And that's the overbilling part. But even worse is under delivery, basically blocking treatments, needed treatments to older patients that are on Medicare Advantage.
Yeah.
And there's systemic examples of that as well. So I think the Dr. Oz part kind of shows, well, it's all well and good that RFK is going to make America healthy again, but shunting people into both a budget busting and insurance coverage depriving Medicare Advantage program, if in fact that's what Dr. Oz do. He's paid spokesman. He's talked when he was running for Senate in Pennsylvania about making Medicare Advantage for all. He's certainly a supporter of that program. I think that's much more dangerous.
Yeah. Absolutely. Completely
Yes.
agree. He, to me, sounds like a grifter, but a grifter who does have this kind of dangerous um, policy
Yeah.
platform.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we'll get to a couple questions, I guess. A couple are about my book. Yeah, go read my book, Chain of Title, which was written in 2016. Pam Bondi is one of the key villains, basically, in that book.
Mm.
And that entire story about how she threw out June Clarkson, Teresa Edwards, and the work that they were doing is chronicled in that
Mm.
book. Yeah, on the bookshelves, or in your local library, wherever you want it. Chain of title. So we had another question though that was more not just saying how anything about my book. Jared says, any update on the Treasury Secretary sweepstakes? Is Scott Bessent still in the lead? Let me
Mm.
give a little background here. So Treasury Secretary is a really obviously very important position, but it's one of the few in the cabinet that remains unfilled. And there's an interesting set of reasons for that. Um, Basically, Donald Trump wants two things out of the Treasury Secretary. He
Mm.
wants someone with the respect of Wall Street who will keep, won't crash stock prices if he's named. He will keep stock prices high and be a good soldier for Trump on CNBC and things like that. But he also wants someone who will implement his tariff policies.
Mm.
And those two things are kind of incompatible because Wall Street doesn't like the tariff policies. So Trump, I think, has been struggling to find a mix of someone who's actually going to implement what he wants, but also isn't going to spook the markets. And so it started with this guy, Scott Bessent, who, of all things, was a hedge fund guy who worked for many, many years with Soros Fund Management. And we worked with George
Mm.
Soros, this big boogeyman on the right, for years. So that was Bessent. And then it looked like Howard Lutnick, who's with Cantor Fitzgerald, a big Wall Street firm. It looked like the two of them were clashing, and Elon Musk came in on Lutnick's side, and there was a lot of dissension between the two. Um, Ultimately, Lutnick was made Commerce Secretary, Bessent's still hanging out there. And then Trump sort of asked for other names and other ideas. And now two other people have come in. One is Kevin Warsh, who was a Federal Reserve governor in the first Trump administration, and he's the heir to he married into the Estee Lauder fortune, and his father-in-law is like buds with Trump going back to college. So there's some connections there. And then the other guy is Mark Rowan, who is one of the co-founders of a private equity firm, of Apollo Global
Mm.
Management. And both of those picks probably also have this dichotomy. They would be, favorable to Wall Street, but clearly Trump is trying to get some sort of guarantee that they're not going to bash his tariff program. They're going to carry it out, and all of that. And it does seem like inside the administration, in the White House, in as one of these czars that actually does everything, and the cabinet official maybe is more of a figurehead. There's this guy, Robert Lighthizer, who was the U.S. Trade Representative in the first Trump administration, very pro-tariff, probably would be too unfavorable to Wall Street to be named Treasury Secretary, but might be named sort of the trade czar working in the White House to actually implement these policies, and put pressure on the Treasury Secretary to assist in that, without actually having to be confirmed by the Senate or be the Treasury Secretary, be this sort of public face.
Can I ask a question? This is
Please.
sort of diagonal, but you were saying, right, like Wall Street likes Trump to some extent. Like the stock market went up when he was elected, but
Sure.
also tariffs would be bad and they don't like those. So, what is the explanation for that discrepancy? Like, if Trump is
Well,
proposing, yeah, things that
think
are
about some of the other
economically
things he's
bad.
proposed. Let's think about some of the other things he's proposing first, right? He
Mm,
wants lower corporate tax rates. He
yeah.
wants more deregulation so that compliance with regulatory measures is not going to be as strict in the second Trump administration. All of those things benefit corporations. Uh,
So
there's
it
probably going
balances
to be
out.
there's probably going to be a less stringent merger policy, which means that
Yes.
incumbent companies can go wild on mergers and acquisitions. So
Yeah.
you put all that together, and it's very pro-business, right?
Mm,
But then this tariff thing, which would increase the price of imports, and a lot of companies use imports to make as materials to make their finished products, as well as actually just construct their stuff overseas, right? Their factories are there, and all of those imports would cost money.
mhm.
That they don't like, right? That
Yeah.
raises their costs, and it might raise prices to the extent that it causes slowed economic activity, especially if the
Mhm.
Federal Reserve reacts by raising interest rates. So there are obviously things that Wall Street sees, that investors see, that would be positive, and there are things that investors see that they think might be a little bit negative. And so that's kind of the push and pull.
Which
Uh,
outweighs the other.
which outweighs the other, exactly. And I think investors are hoping that somebody comes in there who kind of pulls the wool over Trump's eyes and
Mhm.
says, yeah, 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 we'll do the tariffs later, and then just moves forward with standard Republican tax cut
Yeah.
deregulation policy, which may be good for the stock market, at least in the short term, is kind of a sugar high, but in the long term doesn't actually get us to a place of economic growth that would create lasting value. So I think that's kind of where the differences lie. But let's say there was another question about NASA, which I don't know anything about. I mean, I
I
don't know
don't
anything about.
either.
He hasn't named a NASA administrator in this term. The first term, I believe, it was a congressman from Oklahoma. What I think we can say, and maybe this gets us into a different place, is that right now, most of NASA has been privatized. And one of the companies that is doing the work that NASA would be doing, including a mission to Mars, is Elon Musk, right? With SpaceX. And what are you seeing, or what are you thinking about? It does seem like Musk might be wearing out his welcome a little bit in Trump world. Like he's kind of always by his side. He's like a devil
Yeah,
on the shoulder of Donald Trump.
yeah.
And he's running this, or in charge, co-lead with Vivek Ramaswamy of this Department of Government Efficiency.
Hmm.
But he seems to have a lot of influence. He's
Yeah.
throwing his weight around on certain cabinet selections, and he's very much a public face. What do you think about how that's going to turn out here?
Okay. I think he is an incredibly funny character, and I think it's funny that he and Vivek and all of these little cronies have kind of glommed on to Trump, and he's like this disgruntled dad of all of these needy children, and that is objectively very funny. But on a more serious note, I think that Elon Musk represents this incredibly dangerous trend that I can only imagine we will see through the entirety of this administration and potentially afterwards. I think that the fact that he is able to have so much clear influence over Trump and over the actual policies and people that Trump chooses to pursue without any of the kind of formalities that most people who actually work in government have to undergo. For example, like divesting from his companies or just making sure that he is kind of neutral and that his focus is on what benefits the people and what benefits the government. The fact that he is able to kind of have his cake and eat it too by remaining in his corporate role, getting all the benefits from his companies while also having a direct line to the president is terrifying to me. And it feels like almost a kind of regression closer to this like model of oligarchs who are able to sort of dick around with their business interests and just, you know,
That's a
without
technical term,
any,
right?
yes.
Dick around. So yeah, I mean, it looks like Doge is going to operate as kind of a government advisory committee that will make recommendations that can then be implemented in some form or fashion. Musk and Ramaswamy put out an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this week that kind of talked about how they think about the process. So I think there's a couple things to say there. The first thing is, if it is indeed a federal advisory committee, there are actually
Mhm.
rules that federal advisory
Yeah.
committees have to adhere to. That includes representation on the committee, like it's supposed to have a certain balance. It shouldn't be just the Elon and Vivek show.
Mhm.
There's supposed to be open meetings under federal open meetings laws, so they are open to the public and viewable in some form. And records are supposed to be maintained and preserved, and can be, requested under the Freedom of Information Act. So it's not clear that any of those things are going to be undertaken by this advisory committee, and I think that you will see some fights over that. So that's number one. Number two, when you look at the op-ed and what they say they want to do, I think there's a lot of kind of legal policymaking that they want to engage in. So, they point out some of these new rulings from the Supreme Court, West Virginia versus EPA, and Loper Bright Industries ruling from last year that sort of chips away at the authority that federal regulatory agencies have.
Mm.
And they say that, well, because of those two rulings, a lot of the regulations that are out there are actually illegal. And so we can have the government just cancel all those rulings, those regulations, and that will save the government money. Vivek has also talked about, eliminating as much as one quarter of the federal workforce, which, sounds like, wow, that would be a real budget savings. But the workforce, like salaries and benefits, compensation for federal employees, is 4% of the total accumulated federal budget. Most of the budget goes to weapon systems and Social Security and Medicare, and that's it, right? The workforce is a tiny, tiny amount. So if you get rid of a quarter of the federal workforce, which it's very unclear that you could do even and maintain the functioning of the government. But let's say you could, and you get rid of a quarter, that's 1% of the federal budget, right? So it's not going to really make a huge difference. Um, so I think that this organization is looking under the wrong, in the wrong haystacks for
Hmm.
their particular needles. Like
Yeah.
there are things that are very big and very perhaps wasteful, and the vulnerabilities, the burden of cutting the budget would fall on people who are very equipped to handle it, like weapons contractors and Medicare Advantage practitioners. Like you get rid of that $100 billion a year that big insurance is robbing the federal government of. You could save $1 trillion over a long period of time, over a decade.
Someone should tell them that there's, in their midst, they can go slash 1 trillion
They could
and
they
have
could get
them
that right there.
set them out.
They could probably get another trillion from just getting rid of wasteful weapon systems within the defense industrial base. The F-35 plane, which has been over a decade in
Oh
the making,
God.
has cost over $1 trillion to date, and there are indications that it doesn't fly well in the rain. So this is what we're talking about here. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, you can find 2 trillion, but not if you're looking at the federal workforce and looking at, cutting penny ante regulations, which might help, the bottom line of corporations, but certainly not going to do a whole lot for, the federal government's bottom line. So that's my view on that. But I think you speak actually to a larger point, which is about sort of the merging of state and the corporation. I mean, that's what you're
Yes.
really talking about, right? And
Yep.
in that sense, yeah, I think that having the world's richest man be an appendage of the presidency is,
It's
there are
terrifying.
yeah, and I mean, you think about formal definitions of fascism. It really is a merger of the state and the corporation, and so it's hard to escape that fact. Now, Musk was one of the ones out there who apparently was way in the corner of Matt Gaetz, and wanted to continue with him and thought everything would blow over in terms of all these scandals. So, the political instincts of Elon Musk are, I think, the most charitable thing we can say is they are untested. And what we can probably say is they are not very good.
Yep.
I think there are political risks to Trump for having Elon Musk be such a big a fundamental part of his presidency, his second
Mhm.
term. And I think
Yep.
at some elemental level, in the lizard brain of Donald Trump, he knows that. Like he's already kind of getting wary of the guy. And, what we know of Trump is that at the first sign that somebody in his orbit is weighing him down, he will
Hmm.
jettison them in the most humiliating way possible.
Yep.
And so I see that in on the horizon for Elon Musk.
Yes. I think that is a very good prediction. We'll come back to that.
We will definitely come back to that. One of the things I want to get into now, we have about 20
Mhm.
minutes left or so, is I know you've been doing some reporting. It hasn't come out yet, but I know you've been doing some reporting on what I think is really the animating impulse of Donald Trump. I think it's the
Yeah.
thing he's most interested in doing and the most likely to do, and that is this mass deportation program. We heard a little bit more about that this week and how he would actually undertake that. So why don't you talk about what you've been hearing about in terms of that?
Yeah. So I have some notes. Forgive me if I'm looking down.
No problem.
But there are a lot of moving parts here, and that's part of the story is just there's not necessarily one clear direction that is an obvious way to undertake something like a mass deportation. There are a lot of moving parts and a lot of different pieces of legislation that the Trump administration could potentially use to facilitate a mass deportation. But every piece of that each potential piece of legislation has kind of its reasons that it might not work, and it's opening for challenges from the left or just from anyone who doesn't want to see a mass deportation. But to kind of do a little overview of some of the options, I guess you could say, that Trump might have if he wants to undergo something like this. There's the National Emergencies Act, which is from 1976, and it is a potentially dangerous piece of legislation because it has few guidelines that actually define what an emergency is, and so when it can be used and how it can be used. And I believe it's actually the law that Biden used, at least in part, to try to cancel student loan debt. So it has a
Mm,
very, I think it
no.
is. No? Okay. Well,
No, that was a thing called the HEROES Act. That was
mm,
a separate thing. It had to
okay.
do with a public emergency, but it was a separate.
Yeah.
It specifically cited what the
Mhm.
education secretary can do in the time of a public emergency around
Okay.
cutting student loan balances. So yeah.
So the issue with this particular act is what is an emergency? Does this count as an emergency? So this potentially could be something that Trump could use to try to mobilize a mass deportation. Other options that I guess he has would be um, the Posse Comitatus Act, which is essentially the use of the military in kind of a civilian context, which has been a pretty strong red line for people in the past in the Trump administration. A lot of his kind of people that are more on the military defense side have blocked a lot of Trump's desires to do things like that in the past. But it just depends who will be in his administration and who might be willing to kind of take those steps to block his actions. There's also the Insurrection Act that was used. Let's see. No, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were in the
Right.
past. Yeah.
This
So the
is
Alien and
late 18th
Sedition,
century. Yeah.
it is. And it was most recently used during World War II for the internment camps of Japanese
Hmm.
Americans. And
Hmm.
so, not a great history with this law. And um, it can only be used, I believe, if the US is formally at war with a sovereign power, which we are not. So hopefully that would be enough to kind of block the use of something like this. But when you look back into the history of the internment camps, that is kind of a potentially an example of maybe the sort of thing that Trump and his cronies would want to do. I know that Stephen Miller, who is a really strong, probably the strongest voice in Trump's ear with respect to immigration and deportations, has talked about building camps um, near the southern border to just hold people who are crossing that border, which would be very terrifying. And you would see, I think it's safe to say, horrible conditions if something like that were to start. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Donald Trump, sort of formally cares what
Yeah.
authority he claims for this, nor will he care if there are challenges to what that claim is going to be. Jules in the chat mentions, how will this be different from Operation Wetback, which was
Hmm.
the actual name of a Eisenhower era deportation program. I think that was more involved with, farm workers who were let into the country under temporary visas. I think this is going to go well beyond that. Although a lot of, temporary placements in the United States for both asylum seekers and also people from select countries who have come in over the last couple of years, from Nicaragua and Haiti and Venezuela, will be probably first in line, I think, on the top of the list, mainly because their whereabouts are a little bit more known, in terms of, they have to, asylum seekers have to say, okay, give us some sort of forwarding address, and we will get to you with some sort of credible fear kind of hearing, to make
Yeah.
sure that you indeed can claim asylum in the United States. So there is an address there. There's a way to find people. That's one question that I think I've fielded from other people is, okay, you say, Donald Trump, you're going to deport in mass quantities the illegal immigrants who are in the country. How do you know where to find these people? Who is an illegal immigrant? The last time we did this on a big scale, and I'm referring to both the Eisenhower era program and others, a lot of legal immigrants have been thrown out of the country kind of in the exchange. A lot of people who have every right to be in the United States were tossed out. You certainly hear all the time about how Puerto Ricans should go back to their country when they are legal citizens. They are American citizens. So I think, and I don't know if you've talked to people about this, but I think that's, the how do you mechanically do this in a way that actually achieves the objective of removing undocumented people from the country while leaving documented people here?
Yeah, so I have not talked on the record to folks yet about that specifically, but I think what you said is something that I have definitely come across in research and heard from people in kind of like off-record conversations is the idea that this could be kind of precisely done is, at least as far as we know, kind of a fever dream. And this would not be some, well, like targeted operation. It would just be kind of, I'm sure it would devolve into basically just a racist profiling, um, based
Right. And
policy.
the first thing that kind of inspired a real kind of resistance in the first Trump term was the situation with the Muslim ban, right?
Mhm.
So in the first week of the Trump administration, he issued this ban on, basically travel from certain
Yeah.
countries. I happened to be coming back to LAX when that was
Mhm.
happening. So I happened to be in the airport when that all went down, and a protest started like one terminal down at LAX from
Oh, wow.
where I was from. So I was actually participated in that event, at least by witnessing it.
Mhm.
And it was very spontaneous. And people went to the airports in large numbers to protest the fact that people weren't being allowed into the country. And the question is, if you get into a situation where there are these mass raids, they are coming into blue areas where a lot of immigrants are. They're coming into big urban cities. And they're forcibly removing people from their homes and taking them out and raiding workplaces or whatever they're doing to get people to deport them. Is there going to be that renewed resistance to this policy? That I think
And
is a key unanswered question.
yes, that is. And then also, another question that your comment brought up is who is actually conducting these raids, right? Because a lot of blue cities, I'm sure a lot of you know about sanctuary cities. There are specific policies that a lot of blue areas put in place to kind of protect against something like this in the past Trump administration that say that local law enforcement groups cannot kind of collaborate with ICE. So that would be another question is kind of how, if Trump wanted to do something like this, who would he mobilize and what would the kind of sticking points for that mobilization
Right.
of law enforcement be?
And of course, this week, what we heard is that the military could be
Yeah,
involved in that process, which has stoked some dissent even on the right among the more
exactly.
libertarian kind of elements of the Republican coalition.
Hmm.
Rand Paul, I saw saying, that's not
Mm,
a good look to turn the military
yeah.
on its citizens. That's kind of the worst nightmare of the libertarian mindset is that the
Yeah.
military would, infringe on liberties at the point of a gun. And Trump would run up against, if he did, in fact, bring out the military for this, he would have problems among his part of his base. He would certainly
He
have
definitely
problems on
would.
the left, and he might even have problems within the military, within enlisted men who are
Yes.
asked to do this. So,
And
uh,
also within, the kind of like officer core of the military. These are people who like are in more leadership roles, who are college graduates. And I could definitely see that being a red line for a lot of people in those positions and higher.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and that speaks to the fact that another thing that Trump is talking about carrying out are court martials of
Mm,
various military high-ranking officers who he sees as enemies, whether it's generals or things of that nature. Really getting involved in that aspect of it in a huge way. And, that would certainly be unprecedented. I'm certainly not one to build up the military as a key element of the resistance, but we have actually seen that in many countries around the world
mhm.
when there are dictatorial forces that the military often, it's one of two things, right? They're either in concert with those forces or they operate as a bulwark of getting those authoritarians out and returning back to a civilian control. I think there are a lot of cross-cutting forces, and one of the interesting things I think about the Gaetz debacle is that I think there is a lot of fatalism in the Democratic coalition. And in
Mhm.
people who didn't vote for Trump, they see, oh, this guy's coming back. He's
Yeah.
unchecked. He has the Supreme Court in his pocket. He has everything going for him. He has both houses of Congress. He has the judiciary. There's nothing's going to stop him. And anytime you sort of put out something, whether on social media or whatever, there's this tendency of fatalism
Yeah.
that how's that going to do anything? And here we have, one of his very first picks before he even gets into office,
Mhm.
in one of the most important agencies, at least from his mindset, that he needs to block, designs on, blunting his power. He's extremely angry at the Justice Department for daring to prosecute him or attempt to prosecute him. Uh, and it failed, right?
Yeah.
It didn't fail because of, you
The
know,
resistance.
the system. Yeah, it failed because of there was something that was too far, and it was a combination of
Mhm.
public opinion that moved even Republicans who weren't in
Exactly.
his corner, right? And so I question, the idea that we have to be so fatalistic about everything that is going to happen.
Mm.
in the coming weeks and months, there is a possibility for pushing back. There's a possibility to make Trump unpopular. There is a likelihood, I would say, of in 2 years' time having a much different outcome because, it's the dog who caught the car. Trump now is in control of this government. And if inflation goes up, that's on him. And if,
Yeah,
he carries out policies that are very unpopular, that's on him too.
yep. I completely agree. I think the Gates situation was, at least from my perception of it, something where Gates screwed himself up and Republicans stopped it as well. That was not like hashtag resistance libs. They managed to kind of do that all by themselves. So I don't know how much hope I can kind of put into Republicans to kind of continue doing things like that, but I hope that, you know,
Well, there's a thing to be said for institutional power of the
yeah.
various separate branches of government. Another good example that you aren't hearing much about now, especially now that Gates is withdrawn. Gates withdrawing is kind of a it's a tacit admission that we're not going to see recess appointments of cabinet
Mm,
members or Senate confirmed
mhm.
nominees, right? Because if we were
Yeah.
just going to do recess appointments, Gates wouldn't have gone anywhere, and Trump would have carried out this recess appointment policy, and then he would have gone in. But that didn't happen. They said
Mhm.
he can't be confirmed, and
Yeah.
therefore he is going to withdraw himself, and then they nominated somebody else. So the Republicans may not have a lot of differences with Donald Trump, but they're going to defend their ability to use the advise and consent power to determine
Yeah.
who these nominees are going to be. And it's not about do they agree or disagree with Trump. It's about protecting kind of the various sets of and locus of power within the various branches of government. And during the first term, not every single court ruling went Trump's way.
Mm.
Many rules and things of that nature were struck down by the courts,
Yeah.
even the Supreme Court. And we're certainly seeing the formation of, a more of a legal resistance among attorneys general and advocates to use the courts in the way that Republican AGs and advocates used the courts during the Biden administration. It won't be the same courts. Hassan Kanu, actually, our staff writer, had a piece about this just the other day on our site. Um, it won't be the same courts.
Mm.
It'll be, it was the Fifth Circuit in Texas and Louisiana in the during the Biden administration. During the Trump administration, it'll be the Fourth Circuit in Maryland or the
Yeah.
DC Circuit or the Ninth Circuit in
Nice.
California. That will be more of where this activity takes place. And so I think that it speaks to the idea that we don't have to be just so doomsaying about what's going to happen in the next 4 years. In fact, a lot of it is unpredictable.
Yeah. And doom doesn't get us anywhere. Um, you know, doesn't do anything
Right.
productive. So,
Right. I mean, what do you think about? There are certainly a lot of conversations going on. We have about 5 minutes left,
mhm.
but there's certainly a lot of conversations going on about the future of the Democratic Party
Mm.
and where we go from here. And like
Yeah.
there's a lot of recriminations going on between progressives and moderates and things of that
Yeah.
nature. Where do you land on that? What do you think about that debate?
Oh, it's a good question. And I'm still figuring out exactly where I land. One thing that I kind of don't buy into is the idea, or that I don't fully buy into, is the idea that the progressive wing of the party has kind of pushed Democrats too far left and that that is what did this election. I think that, um, I Trump is a appealing figure to a lot of Americans, and I actually wrote a piece with one of my colleagues, Janie, which will be coming out about,
Hmm.
the kind of efforts after the election to vilify trans people and throw trans Americans sort of under the bus. And we wrote that, that is a very dangerous impulse to kind of turn transgender Americans into this representation of quote unquote, woke progressive shifts that we've seen in the past 8 to 12 years. Um, I think that's a really dangerous impulse to sort of say that we've gone too far on, advancing rights for these marginalized groups like trans Americans or whoever else it may be. And
Right.
I'm very disappointed when I see Democrats try to get more appeal by throwing those groups under the bus. So that is one thing that I can say I for sure believe. Otherwise, I don't know. I think we need to, an argument that I've seen some people make that I do find convincing is that we need to have a coherent, 5 words explanation for why things are bad. Like Trump had a lot of explanations, quick explanations for why things are hard. It was like immigrants are taking your jobs. That's a quick explanation. Or, Bidenomics didn't work, or inflation, or whatever it may be. And
Right.
when I try to think about those equivalent, easy, quick explanations that actually speak to what people are going through, I don't have as quick or as easy an answer.
Right.
And I think we need
Better
to work a bit
elevator
more.
pitch. Better,
Yeah,
better,
better
better
elevator
bumper
pitch.
stickers. Yeah. Okay. Oh, there was one more question I wanted to get to from Steve Kane, who
Mhm.
asked about quick comments on the compromise for judicial appointments. I'll briefly describe this since I'd probably be the last thing we do. Earlier this week, I think it was yesterday, it came out that there was this compromise struck in the Senate, which is trying to use its last days in control to confirm some of Joe Biden's judicial appointments. And there are a lot to do. And, in the Senate, one senator can gum up the works and everything takes a
Mhm.
long time. And so there was this compromise made where Democrats said, okay, we will be allowed to get 4 lower court nominees approved, but we will leave open for higher court appellate judges.
Mm.
We'll leave those seats open, and then Donald Trump presumably will be allowed to fill them at the beginning of the next term. Now, when I saw this, I was kind of outraged, like, because really the only exchange here is time. If Democrats wanted to, they can block all of these objections from Republicans and get people nominated and get people confirmed. It just takes a little time. So it kind of seemed like senators wanted to go home for Thanksgiving, and so they gave 4 appellate court seats to Donald Trump. Now, I learned more about this, and it's a little bit less than meets the eye. One of those open appellate court seats doesn't actually have a nominee. One of them, the nominee that's in place right now, doesn't have enough Democratic votes to be confirmed. One of them is an open seat that was made open by a Democratic judge retiring, and that Democratic judge could simply unretire and therefore take away that seat from Donald Trump being able to put in place. And so when I looked at it, it was really only they were giving up 1 seat, not really 4. But I would still argue that 1 seat is too much. I don't know what they're getting out
Yeah.
of this,
Yeah.
other than they get to go to their comfy homes and their childhood bedrooms. I don't understand what the benefit is for Democrats, and so I think it's another case of taking the path of least resistance. And we'll probably write about this in the next week of Chuck Schumer not being sort of a wartime consigliere, right? Not being someone who's going to really take the fight to Republicans and maximize the tools at his disposal to get work done. And it's a sad thing, and obviously we're in the middle of this lame duck session. Time is running short, and so I think giving up pieces of leverage doesn't make any sense to me. You agree. So we're going to move on.
I do
Uh,
agree.
we've come to the end of the weekly roundup. I'm David Dayen. Emma Janssen, writing fellow, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
We are not going to have one of these next week. It's the day after Thanksgiving. Everybody's going to be shopping. And so we're not going to do a Black Friday edition of the weekly roundup, but we will be back in 2 weeks' time. And we will put this, just like we do always, we will put this up on our website so that you can take a look at it. So thank you for being here. And